Welcome to Australia. The history of Australia is the history of the land and peoples which comprise the Commonwealth of Australia. The modern nation came into existence on the 1st of January, 1901, as a federation of former British colonies. The human history of Australia, however, commences with the arrival of the first ancestors of Aboriginal Australians by sea from maritime Southeast Asia between 50,000 and 65,000 years ago, and continues to the present-day multicultural democracy. Aboriginal Australians settled throughout continental Australia and many nearby islands. The artistic, musical and spiritual traditions they established are among the longest surviving in human history. One of the ancestors of today's ethnically and culturally distinct Torres Strait Islanders arrived from what is now Papua New Guinea around 2,500 years ago, and settled the islands on the northern tip of the Australian landmass. Dutch navigators explored the western and southern coasts in the 17th century and named the continent New Holland. Macassar and Trapangas visited Australia's northern coasts from around 1720, and possibly earlier. In 1770, Lieutenant James Cook charted the east coast of Australia and claimed it for Great Britain. He returned to London with accounts favouring colonisation at Botany Bay, now in Sydney. The first fleet of British ships arrived at Botany Bay in January 1788 to establish a penal colony. In the century that followed, the British established other colonies on the continent, and European explorers ventured into its interior. This period saw a decline in the Aboriginal population and the disruption of their cultures due to introduced diseases, violent conflict and dispossession of their traditional lands. From 1871, the Torres Strait Islanders welcomed Christian missionaries, and the islands were later annexed by Queensland, choosing to remain a part of Australia when Papua New Guinea gained independence from Australia a century later. Gold rushes and agricultural industries brought prosperity. Transportation of British convicts to Australia was phased out from 1840 to 1868. Autonomous parliamentary democracies began to be established throughout the 6 British colonies from the mid-19th century. The colonies voted by referendum to unite in a federation in 1901, and modern Australia came into being. Australia fought as part of British Empire and later Commonwealth in the 2 World Wars, and was to become a long-standing ally of the United States through the Cold War to the present. Trade with Asia increased, and a post-war immigration program received more than 7 million migrants from every continent. Supported by immigration of people from almost every country in the world since the end of World War II, the population increased to more than 25.5 million by 2021, with 30% of the population born overseas. The ancestors of Aboriginal Australians moved into what is now the Australian continent about 50,000 to 65,000 years ago, during the last glacial period, arriving by land bridges and short sea crossings from what is now Southeast Asia. The Majid Beeb rock shelter in Arnhem Land, in the north of the continent, is perhaps the oldest site of human occupation in Australia. From the north, the population spread into a range of very different environments. Devil's Lair in the extreme southwest of the continent was occupied around 47,000 years ago, and Tasmania by 39,000 years ago. 8. The oldest human remains found are at Lake Mungo in New South Wales, which have been dated to around 41,000 years ago. The site suggests one of the world's oldest known cremations, indicating early evidence for religious ritual among humans. The spread of the population also altered the environment. From 46,000 years ago, firestick farming was used in many parts of Australia to clear vegetation, make travel easier, and create open grasslands rich in animal and vegetable food sources. The Aboriginal population faced significant changes in the climate and environment. About 30,000 years ago, sea levels began to fall, temperatures in the southeast of the continent dropped by as much as 9 degrees Celsius, and the interior of Australia became more arid. About 20,000 years ago, New Guinea and Tasmania were connected to the Australian continent, which was more than a quarter larger than today. About 19,000 years ago, temperatures and sea levels began to rise. Tasmania became separated from the mainland some 14,000 years ago, and between 8,000 and 6,000 years ago thousands of islands in the Torres Strait and around the coast of Australia were formed. The warmer climate was associated with new technologies. Small back-bladed stone tools appeared 15 to 19,000 years ago. Wooden javelins and boomerangs have been found dating from 10,000 years ago. Stone points for spears have been found dating from 5 to 7,000 years ago. Spear throwers were probably developed more recently than 6,500 years ago. Aboriginal Tasmanians were isolated from the mainland from about 14,000 years ago. As a result, they only possessed 1/4 of the tools and equipment of the adjacent mainland. Coastal Tasmanians switched from fish to abalone and crayfish, and more Tasmanians moved to the interior. Around 4,000 years ago, the first phase of occupation of the Torres Strait Islands began. By 2,500 years ago, more of the islands were occupied, and a distinctive Torres Strait Islander maritime culture emerged. Agriculture also developed on some islands, and by 700 years ago villages appeared. Aboriginal society consisted of family groups organized into bands and clans averaging about 25 people, each with a defined territory for foraging. Clans were attached to tribes or nations, associated with particular languages and country. At the time of European contact, there were about 600 tribes or nations, and 250 distinct languages with various dialects. Estimates of the Aboriginal population at this time range from 300,000 to 1 million. Aboriginal society was egalitarian with no formal government or chiefs. Authority rested with elders and group decisions were generally made through the consensus of elders. The traditional economy was cooperative, with males generally hunting large game while females gathered local staples such as small animals, shellfish, vegetables, fruits, seeds and nuts. Food was shared within groups and exchanged across groups. Some Aboriginal groups engaged in firestick farming, fish farming, and built semi-permanent shelters. The extent to which some groups engaged in agriculture is controversial. Some anthropologists describe traditional Aboriginal Australia as a complex hunter-gatherer society. Aboriginal groups were semi-nomadic, generally ranging over a specific territory defined by natural features. Members of a group would enter the territory of another group through rites established by marriage and kinship, or by invitation for specific purposes, such as ceremonies and sharing abundant seasonal foods. As all natural features of the land were created by ancestral beings, a group's particular country provided physical and spiritual. Aboriginal Australians developed a unique artistic and spiritual culture. The earliest Aboriginal rock art consists of handprints, hand stencils, and engravings of circles, tracks, lines and cupules, and has been dated to 35,000 years ago. Around 20,000 years ago, Aboriginal artists were depicting humans and animals. According to Australian Aboriginal mythology and the animist framework, the dreaming is a sacred era in which ancestral totemic spirit beings formed the creation. The dreaming established the laws and structures of society, and the ceremonies performed to ensure continuity of life and land. He noted in his journal that he could land no more upon this eastern coast of New Holland, and on the western side I can make no new discovery, the honour of which belongs to the Dutch navigators, and as such they may lay claim to it as their property. Italicized words crossed out in the original, but the eastern coast from the latitude of 38 south down to this place I am confident was never seen or visited by any European before us, and therefore by the same rule belongs to Great Britain. Italicized words crossed out in the original. In March 1772 Marc Joseph Marion du Fresne, in command of 2 French ships, reached Van Diemen's Land on his way to Tahiti and the South Seas. His party became the first recorded Europeans to encounter the indigenous Tasmanians and to kill one of them. In the same year, a French expedition led by Louis Alino de Saint-Ouen became the first Europeans to formally claim sovereignty over the west coast of Australia, but no attempt was made to follow this with colonization. John Harris, in his Navigantium ac Itinerantium Bibliotheca, or Voyages and Travels, 1744 to 1748, 1764, recommended exploration of the east coast of New Holland, with a view to a British colonization. John Cowlander put forward a proposal in 1766 for Britain to found a colony of banished convicts in the South Sea or in Terra Australis. Sweden's King Gustav III had ambitions to establish a colony for his country at the Swan River in 1786, but the plan was stillborn. The American Revolutionary War, 1775 to 1783, saw Britain lose most of its North American colonies and consider establishing replacement territories. Britain had transported about 50,000 convicts to the New World from 1718 to 1775 and was now searching for an alternative. The temporary solution of floating prison hulks had reached capacity and was a public health hazard, while the option of building more jails and workhouses was deemed too expensive. In 1779, Sir Joseph Banks, the eminent scientist who had accompanied James Cook on his 1770 voyage, recommended Botany Bay as a suitable site for a penal settlement. Banks's plan was to send 200 to 300 convicts to Botany Bay where they could be left to their own devices and not be a burden on the British taxpayer. Thank you.